We're going to devote our energies to sports and gardening, all the cultural pursuits as far as they're concerned. In fact, we're going to put the goons to sleep. Meanwhile, we dig.
Here we go again.
This is Burning Power, coming to you on a gray, lovely, overcast day with patches of blue here in Tbilisi, Georgia. And what we're doing today is a bit of a remix of my How We Got Here series. And I've already done this for music, and it just seemed right that I should do a smaller one for my discussion of movies in the saga and their meaning to us in our saga of how we got here. So we're going to do this in two parts. The first part will be covering basically the 1960s to, well, the late 60s, 1970s and 80s. And the second part will be the 90s and beyond. And we will take it from there. By the way, yes, you can like and subscribe and all those wonderful things to this channel, and you can even provide a little sustenance. There's a link below to do that. The movies of the 1970s have to be some of the most sad, nihilistic, depressing movies to ever become box office sensations. The Godfather 1 and 2, both huge hits, both extraordinarily dark. Let's see, The Exorcist. Jaws isn't exactly a friendly film, even though it's got a nice ending. They killed the shark, but most of the film is about the collapse of the suburban dream. Thank you, Steven Spielberg, for that. But, you know, The Exorcist, that doesn't end well, and it was a huge hit. The Omen came out at that time. In fact, 1976 was the darkest period of the 1970s. And we're going to talk more about the 70s, but I just want to end here. We'll come back and talk about it next time more. Anyway, that's too much. So, 1976. We had films like Network, which just showed you how much you were being manipulated by the media. And the answer is a whole lot. It was also the year Carrie came out. Very dark version, darkly humorous at that, Brian De Palma film based on a Stephen King novel of a girl who has problems at school. She has problems with changing from a child into a woman. She is bullied and teased, and then she explodes and takes everyone down with her. The end. Do you see any hope in that story? I didn't. Then there's things like, Taxi Driver. Now, Taxi Driver may be among the more despairing works of the 1970s. Robert De Niro is like a returning Vietnam vet who's drifting around aimlessly in a taxi driver. His life has no meaning. He's trying to give it meaning. He looks for things to give it meaning. At first he thinks he will save this one girl he's kind of fallen in love with, but he himself has lost so much meaning that he thinks taking the girl to a porno film would be a nice idea for a date. So he decides to kill the man she's working for, a politician, thinking that will give his life meaning. And then there's another girl, who's a very young girl, played by Jodie Foster, who is Iris. Travis Bickle, the De Niro character, decides he's going to save her from her pimp. He ends up shooting all these guys, kind of mafiosi, at the end, who are running this rather sordid New York-style 1970s brothel at the time. And in the end, they accidentally think he's a hero because he doesn't go through and shoot the politician. And where's the meaning there? Essentially, we arrive at this point where there are many, many films in the 1970s that get to the realization that if meaning is all just generated by the self, there is no sense of meaning. Or then there's the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which essentially takes a chainsaw to the hippie philosophy and says, you know, this whole love and peace thing, it kind of went too far, and it's full of bullshit. And then the movies that Hollywood, these were successful movies. Carrie, Network. I mean, you can see, I still consider Apocalypse Now, even though it came out in 79. That's definitely a part of the 70s. Even Heaven's Gate, which came out in 1980, is kind of like the end of that era. Very depressing Western movie. And in retrospect, looks better than it did at the time. I saw the full version in the theater. I had moved to New York City by then. And I actually thought it was okay, if long. But a lot of people, the critics just crucified it. I think they were anxious for that period to end. These dark, brooding films, existentialist films mostly, where there is no real choice, there is no God anywhere, there is nothing. So what took its place instead were the blockbusters. So starting with movies like, actually, one of the first ones was Jaws, but Jaws only has that up note at the very end where they defeat the shark. Meanwhile, people are dying left and right in the movie. It's a horror film. But then you get to Rocky. Now, Rocky's the first film that made people feel good. The interesting thing about Rocky is that it's very much a 70s film. He doesn't win at the end. He just ties. And he's happy just to go the distance. And I think that says a lot about the mood of the 70s, where people were just happy to, like, tie. And considered that a triumph, where people are cheering Rocky. It's like, yeah! And Rocky today looks like it's all this, like, triumph over adversity. But it wasn't quite that. You go back to the first Rocky film, it's as dark as The Godfather, tonally. Until the very end, where he just basically makes it. I think it's a pretty good film that holds up still. I'm not going to discuss the later ones. But you should, if you're ever in Prague, go see Buktia Lotki's The Puppet Show, which translates into Cakes and Puppets. Go see their version. It's called Rocky 9. They did a puppet show. If they were ever showing, they occasionally redo it again. But that's side note, parentheses. So the film that really changes everything is Star Wars. It's the film that sets the template, essentially, for where we've been since then in terms of pop culture. It's the film that creates, if the 70s was the new Hollywood, the Star Wars was the first time people had gotten a handle on how to make money off of this new Hollywood. There would still be depressing movies being made. Leaving in Las Vegas, not exactly a bowl of sunshine and smiles. But Star Wars. Box office receipts alone, and the fact that it was a very simple black and white good versus evil tale, that it made people felt, rousing. People, when I was in the theater and one of the first days it opened in California, people hissed at Darth Vader and they cheered at the end in the theater. They clapped. They really liked that. And I think it was the first time in quite a while, maybe since Sound of Music or Mary Poppins, that there had been an unabashedly uncynical take on films. And that was important. Interestingly enough, George Lucas did an extraordinarily depressing science fiction film right before that. Well, not right before, at the beginning of the 70s. And then he did American Graffiti, which had some of that uplifting quality too, although it was kind of conflicted about its sense of memory, but somehow it hit it all with this kind of jivey, loose soundtrack of all these rock and roll songs from the 1950s and early 60s. But Star Wars is the film that changed everything, and in a sense created this artificial world we live in today. Well, I apologize if the sound quality hasn't been quite up to snuff up till this point. I was just using the camera sound and I forgot my little recording device. So there we are. Break in the flow. But hey, this is reality. You make mistakes, and I'm not going to go repeat myself and try to say what I just said again. Because who knows what I just said. I'm just kind of winging it here. In case you think I've got elaborate notes somewhere, I've got one or two words written down. At some point, I mean, when I do lectures, I give lots of, give myself lots of notes. But with this, I'm kind of testing myself just to see what I can do, just rambling off the top of my head. You know, I've spent like 45 years thinking about these things, so I should have a few ideas by this point. So, I wasn't that big of a Star Wars fan. I saw the film about, I don't know, maybe 10, 15 times since it first came out. I saw it a couple of times in the theater. Saw it in a really huge theater in London in 1979 on my way back through. I guess they were letting it come out to prepare people for The Empire Strikes Back, which I do think is the superior film. And Return of the Jedi is not the superior film. Return of the Jedi is the beginning of all the rest of the Star Wars problems. As soon as you bring the Ewoks on there, it's like, no, I'm sorry, that's just cute teddy bear stuff. I'm off the program at this stage. But the reason I didn't get so heavily into Star Wars was because I'd already read the works of George MacDonald, whose dark fantasy, Victorian fantasy literature, Lilith, my all-time favorite. Then there's The Princess and Curdie, The Princess and the Goblin, and especially, well, Lilith is my all-time favorite novel. The Golden Key, my all-time favorite short story. It's just absolutely amazing. Maybe I liked his symbolic, really mystical writing, but also his sense of characters was very interesting as well. And I'd read C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia, The Wind in the Willows, all these children's things. I'd read Moby Dick. I had read Hunchback of Notre Dame, although it's really called Notre Dame de Paris. I had read some other Victor Hugo works. Toilers of the Sea, very interesting novel. The Man Who Laughs. Ooh, I like that one a lot. I had read, quite a bit of classic fiction up at that point. And so Star Wars, it was just like, it just seemed like, it's fluff. And I never thought the names were all that interesting. I never thought the mythology was all that interesting. And yet it's occurred to me ever since then, people have lived for that. Now, I'm not going to talk about why I think they lived for that. I think it has to do with the meaning crisis, though. And once you detach humanity from the meaning of what it means to be a human being, you then open up a freeform universe or alternative universes of your favorite genre of fiction. And that's where we've been ever since. But I'm not going to talk about geekdom and fandoms and all of that stuff now. We'll save that for when we start talking about the 80s or when we eventually get to talking about those things. And you can see the first signs of it in 1974 with something like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. It's hard now to understand what the Texas Chainsaw Massacre felt like for the people who first saw it. They actually previewed it in San Francisco, of all places, which is really fitting, for an audience without really telling you. They just said there's a preview coming up on the film that you're about to watch. And then the Texas Chainsaw Massacre comes on. And there were people who ran out of the building Now, just the name, Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Texas Chainsaw Massacre is actually in line with films like the really monumental Night of the Living Dead by George Romero, which really is the first of this particular series of films. Wes Craven's Last House on the Left would also be in this category. There was a B-rated exploitation film. B as in really substandard. Not A-list Hollywood quality. But the Texas Chainsaw Massacre comes out of the gate as something else entirely. There are humorous aspects to it, but I've shown this film to younger people in the 21st century. People who thought they were cool. People who thought they understood horror films. And the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre, you can just see them sitting in their chairs, backs against it, because it takes no prisoners. And its target is you. What do I mean? Its target is the young and the cool. Its target is whoever it is that's watching. And just the name, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, is enough to start your brain working. Just that word chainsaw, first time it had been used in any sort of cultural setting outside of a hardware store. Texas chainsaw, Texas, hot, sweaty, chainsaw, getting to work, massacre, oops. So you already, before you see the film, imagine gallons and gallons of blood being spilled. There aren't. Most of the blood, I think the only time you really see any device, chainsaw, going into any body is when it accidentally falls on Leatherface's own knee or thigh. Outside of that, you don't ever see it. Everything is suggested with good camera editing, and the suggestion is horrifying. But not only that, it's the whole way the film feels. It feels so sweaty. So muggy. It feels so decayed. And then there's the actual set design of bones and feathers and fur. And what's interesting is, as I think Robin Wood pointed out in his film comment article, the article that got me, this was about 1978. I had not seen it when it first came out because it was the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Why would I go see this? I was a Christian, living in a Christian commune when it came out. So why would I go see the Texas Chainsaw Massacre? But by the end of the 70s, I was thinking a bit differently. I was still a Christian, but I was taking cultural things more seriously. And Robin Wood's article on the return of the repressed in Film Comment in 1978 really got me thinking, like, maybe I missed something here. I should go watch this. And he points out that the house you expect things to happen in, this old decayed mansion, is not where things happen. It's the nice white picket fence house where all the nightmares are inside. But I was really struck personally and aesthetically by the design of bones and it was the textures that really got me. And I thought they were great. I thought they were amazing textures. It was a whole new style of art. Later, I would call that American Gothic art. I have a whole series I've written about the various strains of American Gothic art and culture and literature, painting, films, music that I've done on the Anadrome Life site, and that's worth a read. But what makes the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is just the relentlessness of it. Once it starts, and the weirdness of it. Starting from the very first scenes of decomposing bodies in a cemetery, kind of piled up, as it is said, as grisly works of art, of which the film is. And I really do mean it's a work of art, and it's grisly. But what's important about the film is it starts off with references to entering like the time of Saturn. We're no longer in the age of Aquarius in this film, when things are, supposedly everything is liberating. It's the age of Aquarius, dude. No, this was the age of Saturn, malevolence, darkness, death. That is where we had entered by the end of the 70s. the age of Saturn, in a sense, metaphorically. And the main characters in the film, I don't know if you can call them protagonists, shall we use a Joe Bob Briggs phrase of human pork chops? Because everyone's going to get, except for one person, the final girl, Marilyn Burns playing the Sally Hardesty character, it's going to be, I mean, it's just, it ain't pretty, you know? And, but what it is that they're all kind of young hippies. They're all kind of young, and they are just meat for the slaughter, partly because they're so oblivious in their coolness, which is a lesson I learned. After watching that film, I realized that, nothing comes from being cool. Nothing comes from being like just this young and ignorant and naive. Nothing comes from that at all. And because you don't see what's coming towards you, you have no imagination about what the world is really like. And the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is based on some real things, particularly the crimes of Ed Gein up in Wisconsin, that Tobe Hooper absolutely knew about from his relatives in Wisconsin. So Texas Chainsaw Massacre sets up a metaphor for the destruction of that naive, innocent culture of hippies getting stoned and out of their minds. And I'm not sure, some people have said the film is some sort of anti-meat track. I really doubt it. Even though slaughterhouses show up. No, I think it's really about, as Tobe Hooper said, he came up with the idea when he was standing in line one day at some sort of Texas store, and he was just so frustrated by the technology of waiting and the crowds and people in line and the stupidity. And I'm sure all this other stuff he was frustrated with. And he just saw chainsaws for sale next to it. And he's just like, man, what would happen if I just went through it with this? That would get the job done. They'd get out of the way. Interesting attitude. And it was an attitude that was going to show up somewhere else. Well, it was going to continue to show up in horror films. See the movie Halloween. Of course, then there's Friday the 13th, which is of a lesser quality, but still effective. And that's where you start getting your teenage pork chops, really. Joe Bob Briggs, in reviewing the first Evil Dead movie, calls them spam in a cabin. I love that. It's just, Joe Bob Briggs is one of my favorite writers of all time. Because he's just like, you know, these... Go look for some of Joe Bob Briggs' horror film reviews. They're really worth spending a little time with, just because they're like the films. They're punk, but they're the Texas variation on punk.
I'm talking about the one, the only, the original Evil Dead. Most of you turkeys know by now that I have been waiting 9 years for this night. I wrote letters, I screamed at the jerkolas who had the rights to this movie. I tried to get it for the first annual World Drive-In Movie Festival and Custom Car Rally back in 1982. I called up all the meatpacking plants in Fort Worth thinking they might want to sponsor a screening during Red Meat Week on the Movie Channel. And I fought with the Movie Channel high sheriffs for 4 solid years, and all they ever told me was it's too grisly for cable. Nobody has any respect for the arts in this country anymore. So you're thinking, well, hey, what's the big deal? Just another zombie splatter movie, right? Well, no, there's one difference. There's only one way to kill the zombies. We're talking total dismemberment. Hands, arms, legs, and of course, heads will roll. You thought those were zombies in Night of the Living Dead? Excuse me while I go buy you a copy of Richard Simmons Sings the Frank Stallone Songbook, Wimp City. You think those were zombies in Dawn of the Dead? Wait here just a minute while I go check the showtimes of Flashdance for you. You might want to look around for some leg warmers to wear on your ankles and a t-shirt with Snoopy on the front. Now that Grandma has left the room, let's take a look at the old Evil Dead barf meter. This is the Paint the Room Red Vomit Champion of the 1980s, and as you can see, it's off the scale. You might want to go get a few hefty bags while there's still time. In other words, it's a classic. It follows the Joe Bob Briggs ultimate test of a splatter flick. Anybody can die at any moment. It was the first movie of Sam Raimi, the guy who made Darkman, But this was back when nobody had ever heard of Sam Raimi. We just thought he was a psychopath from Michigan. He checked out some film equipment from Michigan State, got some actors from the university, found an abandoned house in Tennessee, and he did all the amazing special effects in the attic of his house by himself. What a guy. I don't want to tell you anything about the plot, but here at Drive-In Theater, we call it Spam in a Cabin. The teenagers go in, the teenagers do not come out. But it's the way they die that matters. Once you've seen this, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre could be shown on the Disney Channel.
One film that really also deserves to be mentioned along this period, which doesn't quite fit into any category, but it also has this new sensibility about it, and that is Eraserhead, the first feature film by David Lynch, which, what was it, made in 1974, 75, 76. It took 3 or 4 years to make it. It took years on the midnight movie circuit for it to finally gain a following. And what it is it's like he took a camera, put it up to his head, and just filmed his nightmares. Because that's what it looks like. A friend of mine, I went and took him to it in about end of 1979. I was playing a midnight showing in Petaluma, California. And my friend said, well, I'm not going to have any nightmares after that. That film was a nightmare. Exactly. And what's interesting about that nightmare of a film is it has nothing to do with the love and peace generation of the 1960s. It has everything to do with the decay and the urban despair that David Lynch had met when he was going to art school in Philadelphia. And in a way, that was what the 70s was like, whether it was on 8th Avenue in New York City, or whether it was just the kinds of urban decay that were spreading throughout different parts of the country, where it seems like the money was just running out. All these programs that were supposed to help people were failing people. Movies also were very, very important during the 1980s, but not in the way they had been in the 1970s. In the 1970s, movies often contained these existentialist messages, particularly American movies, but also, of course, the European movies. But that started to really disappear in the early 80s, and what took its place, capturing the imagination, was genre movies, particularly science fiction and horror. The 1980s saw the rise of what we call the blockbuster film. This huge spectacle of a film, often done with, elaborate special effects that dominated the box office statistics. Often these films were big summer hits. There's a bit of a prehistory of this in the 80s. You started with something like The Exorcist, and then you had Jaws was a big hit. Rocky was a huge hit along these lines. Star Wars, of course, changed everything, followed by Close Encounters later that same year. And you also had things like The Empire Strikes Back, and you had Alien, you had Superman, and finally Return of the Jedi. All of these set the template for what the blockbuster would be. Now, the earlier ones, like The Exorcist, Jaws, Rocky, those have nothing to do with the blockbuster cycle as we now know it. I mean, they would try to make them that way so that later Rocky films, for instance, are very different in tone from the early Rocky films. The first Rocky was very much a 70s film, not too different from Martin Scorsese's films in tone. And even its note of optimism at the end is only to a draw. It's a tie. It's not the overwhelming victory. That would be reserved for all the Rocky films of the 1980s. But it was Star Wars, of course, that really is the thing that changed everything. And I mentioned that before, so I'm not going to go back into it too much. But the 1980s set the template for the genre blockbuster. It's the thing that has worked as the central money-making component of the film industry ever since. See, in the 1970s, they'd lost their way. They didn't know what worked anymore. So you had huge hits from things like The Godfather. How did that get to be so big? Apocalypse Now, which was 1979, late 79. Still, it eventually made its money back, but it was still a big spectacle, but not in the way we think of spectacles today. It was a very dark spectacle. There's also a shift in cinema culture. The film school generation, that is the generation of people who had been raised for the first time on the film school aesthetic of learning to watch movies and go back. And this was late 60s all the way through the 70s. In the 60s, you had a lot of the directors who would go on to be the great directors of the 70s coming out of these film schools with this knowledge of all of these. I mean, people lined up. It was hard to imagine, but they lined up for foreign films with subtitles. I'm embarrassed for Americans today who say, I don't want to read films. It's just like, oh man, graduate and start getting something different into your system. Not that the foreign films today are on the level of those of the 1950s, 60s, or 70s, but nevertheless, there is a world out there for those of you willing to explore it. There were magazines like Film Comment, American Film, Film Quarterly, although Film Quarterly eventually became the first of these to have been invaded by critical theory. And eventually I couldn't read them at all. By, say, 1981 or 82, they were just like, it was impenetrable jargon by that time. Whereas Film Comment remained quite good up until the last, 5 years or so. They changed and then started becoming... They went from being moderately politically correct to totally politically correct. And so I even, after having a straight run of their magazines going from 1978 all the way up to 2018, I just said, that's enough. They're not getting better. It's getting more of this, it's just all the topics you're supposed to hit. There's no more art, there's just social justice. Tired of it, personally. But in the 1980s, you saw the rise of something very different. You saw the rise, for instance, in specialist magazines like Fangoria or Cinefex, which was this little square book, practically, that came out on a quarterly basis that showed you everything inside of how they made every big blockbuster there was. Also, Cinefantastique was in that category. They were essentially how-to guides, which is really great if that's what you're looking for. That is to say, if you want to learn how to, apply latex paint or, use computer animated tracking, these are, fantastic things to read. If you care about the art of film as opposed to the craft of film, then no, they are not. And there started to be a real division between the people who cared about the art of cinema and the craft of movie making. So that after a while, the craft people essentially took over. And here was another problem. There was a change from more thoughtful, literary, shall we call it, film criticism. People like Pauline Kael and Andrew Saros would write word after word after word describing films they had seen. But eventually you came to people like Siskel and Ebert, who, looking back at them now, they're pretty good. But at the time, they were really a step down. They were the first TV film critics on PBS to go popular nationwide. And they devised this: the thumbs up, thumbs down. And I think a lot of us who really loved film in the early 80s said, this is really a step down. Because now it would just be simply like, and you would see this on the movie posters, Siskel and Ebert, 2 thumbs up. That's not really a movie criticism. And eventually you start getting people like Leonard Maltin writing these books with star ratings, 5 stars, 3.5 stars for me. I met a guy once who said, yeah, if it doesn't get at least 4 stars from Leonard Maltin, I don't want to watch it. To which I'd say, like, do you think he's the only person who has an opinion? It's just like, really? You think this guy knows everything about film, that his particular perspective should be good? No, I'd much rather read a really well thought out essay on the subject. But what really, 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 really damaged the appreciation of films and finally cut the heart out of all that film school nonsense was when they started publishing box office statistics, weekly box office scores. In 1990, no one hardly knew, I'm sorry, not 1990, in 1980, no one hardly knew how much films made. We started to become aware of it throughout the 70s, very slowly. They would say like, Star Wars is the new big money maker, and they would tell you how much it had made. But eventually you started getting these lists and would say like which film had how many millions of dollars in national box office revenue. Well, what eventually happened was people started to equate box office revenue with quality, which is an extraordinarily dangerous thing. It's like saying the top hits of all time that have sold the most are the best music. Now you could argue that, well, the Beatles sold a lot, they were pretty good. But you can't argue that with Britney Spears. So that's what happens too, is you eventually move to the lowest common denominator. If someone figures out a way to sell something that more people will buy, that's what they will make. And that's what happened to cinema during the 1980s. You started, essentially, so what happens is between the specialist fan magazines, which got people salivating for the recent fantasy and science fiction and horror offerings, which created the first geeks, who were really an underground phenomena at the time, but would eventually become the dominant form of communication, the dominant form of... Oh, sorry, some people are talking here. Okay. So the combination of the blockbusters, the failure of the 70s films, they really were too dark and did not provide an answer to most of the questions they posed, or even partial answers. And this new emphasis on the minutiae of filmmaking through these specialist magazines, along with the box office statistics, created a new kind of film person. The kind who cared about how their film was doing, that is financially, how many millions of dollars did Road Warrior take in? I remember thinking, like, come on, do better, because it was a better film than I felt many other films. So who created the geeks and the stats? I think George Lucas gets special pride of place along with Steven Spielberg. And of course the two of them worked on Raiders of the Lost Ark. E.T. was the biggest hit of the decade. But there were all the Star Wars films, Raiders of the Lost Ark, Indiana Jones movies. They were fun. They were good popcorn movies. I don't think there's a lot of depth to them. I mean, I've seen a lot of badly spilt ink over them. But it essentially created this new thing of which Steven Spielberg is often present. Like you can see Steven Spielberg produce Gremlins. Look around here. Yeah, there's Steven Spielberg's name at the bottom of Back to the Future. Steven Spielberg was very smart in getting behind these things and finding a way to monetize all of these products. This is Robert Zemeckis's Who Framed Roger Rabbit, who also became very smart about this whole project. Of course, the Star Trek films came back in. Eventually, Star Trek would be on television. But they knew they had a captive audience. And they knew that they could essentially sell these things over and over and over again. So, like I said, Rocky starts off as a kind of a depressing 70s film, but ends up being this, well, another blockbuster that comes along. They don't spend quite as much on the special effects as they do in the sci-fi horror genre films, but oh boy, did they spend a lot on the explosions. Rambo, again, First Blood, if you go watch it, it's pretty much a 70s film. It is not the big blockbuster. And then, of course, Arnold Schwarzenegger becomes a huge actor during this time, huge in many ways. He was essentially a bodybuilder who becomes this guy. He very shrewdly figured out the system. And that is, he said, I am the special effect. My body is the special effect. Action is the special effect. And so you started getting these science fiction action films. The best of which during the 1980s, for my money, was Road Warrior, which I think George Miller had some genuine ideas here. And this one was produced down in Australia. But alas, who did he run into? Steven Spielberg. Steven Spielberg got him to turn the third Road Warrior, or third Mad Max film, essentially into a Steven Spielberg-esque type of film. Eddie Murphy was also huge during this time, doing these very, very gun-heavy, crime-oriented films, Beverly Hills Cop, which really mixed, for the first time, crime with real bloodshed and comedy. So it was a criminal comedy, but with the emphasis on the comedy. Tom Cruise, by the end of the decade, emerges as one of the big actors. Funny, he still is. He's like the Queen of England. He just never quits and never looks any younger. And then the film that probably deserves credit for really getting the superhero genre up and running. There was Superman in 1979, but Tim Burton's 1989 Batman did the job. After this, there were Batman sequels. Eventually, there would be Marvel movies. And that leads us to the genre most dominant in our times, which would have to be the comic book superhero movie. Okay, let us continue. We talked a bit about films last episode in number 7 when we talked about the surface of the 80s and all the blockbusters and stuff, and how so much of it was genre categories. I mean, there was action and there was science fiction and horror. But now we're going to dive under the horror, because there was a brewing underground horror world. And it started off the decade as more like exploitation. By exploitation, I mean, well, first of all, that means films made to make money, period. Now, in horror, what that means is you got to use as much blood and as much sex and as much of just crazy elements, you got to grab people's attention. The really fascinating thing about exploitation is no one cared about making anyone feel good. It had nothing to do with political correct sensitivity. All of this actually came out of the carnival world in the 1930s. But there was an older school kind of exploitation film which existed particularly in the early 80s and wasn't going to survive the decade. But let's watch a little collage of different elements from it. And if laughing psychotic deer heads on a wall bother you, you should probably turn away. Actually, this is going to be kind of disturbing.
Groovy.
Bastards! Why are you torturing me like this? Why?
That was pretty crazy. Evil Dead 2. It was almost his remaking Evil Dead, which is a really dark horror film, as a comedy. A dark postmodern comedy where the walls are literally laughing at you. Pretty amazing stuff. He would later go on to direct the first 3 Spider-Man movies. And another film, Drag Me to Hell. Sam Raimi is someone who became very important, as did his friends at the time, the Coen brothers. And that's something I should probably mention a bit of. They were also independent, but I'm not going to show you anything from them right now. What killed, however, the old school exploitation movie was several factors. One, drive-ins were drying up. Another thing, places like the grindhouses on 42nd Street were being shut down to prepare for the new Disney-fied 42nd Street. And then also the video store was changing things. So you had these direct-to-video movies. Now with the direct-to-video movies, you started getting people who were able to watch far more films than they ever did before and have more references. So that lent itself to more of this postmodern aesthetic. One of the first companies to really bank on this was a strange company called Troma out of New Jersey. And their first big film was The Toxic Avenger. Let's watch the trailer for that.
Meet little Melvin. He's a 90-pound weakling. Everyone hated Melvin.
I'm gonna take this mop and shove it down your throat.
They teased him.
I want to do it with you. Okay.
They taunted him. They tormented him until he had a horrifying accident and fell into a vat of nuclear waste. transforming little Melvin into a hideously deformed creature of superhuman size and strength. Melvin became the Toxic Avenger, the first superhero born out of nuclear waste. Yes, the muggers and the rapists didn't know what law and order was until the Toxic Avenger came to town.
Why that is so different from the other earlier exploitation films is that it's absolutely self-aware. Much like the Killer Tomatoes movie that came out. These were, killer clowns from outer space, this sort of stuff. And Troma specialized in making these, after a while you had movies that were just knowingly bad. Whereas an exploitation wasn't necessarily knowingly bad. You could call John Carpenter's Halloween an exploitation film, and it's great as far as all the techniques involved. Texas Chainsaw Massacre, another illustration of a great exploitation film. Whereas this new breed of postmodern exploitation film essentially killed it. One of the films that signaled something new near the end of the decade was called Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer. Now, by the standards of, say, the early aughts of the 21st century, Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer is not that intense or crazy. That is to say, it doesn't have scads of bloodshed, even by the standards of many of these R-rated exploitation films. However, this film was given an NC-17, essentially not rated, and the film board absolutely refused to do it. And when you watch the film, you say, why? And when they were asked why, they couldn't point to a reason. They just said it's the whole thing. And the whole thing is dark in extremis. What's dark about it is the mood.
Otis, plug it in.
Notice how the television is used as a weapon. And the idea of the sinister television and the sinister video image is something that shows up more and more. Well, it shows up in punk rock songs and new wave songs in the late 70s, early 80s. And it shows up in films, particularly something like David Cronenberg's Videodrome. And this starts James Woods, and watch the sinister quality of the videotape in this next clip. I mean, you're thinking how can a videotape be sinister? And we're not talking the ring here of what's on it. We're talking about the physical tape itself.
What do you want from me? I want you to open up, Max. Open up to me. I've got something I want to play for you.
Oh my God!
Pretty danged weird. David Cronenberg, one of the highlights of the 1980s. His films always were pushing the envelope, making you think. This whole film was like a collusion between Marshall McLuhan, body horror, and makes you really think about what is television doing to me. Another film that also asks these questions was Steven Soderbergh's film, Sex, Lies, and Videotape. And it's a film well worth watching. We're going to watch a scene here where there is this kind of shady character who comes along into these people's lives, and he has a collection of videotapes of women, interviews with women, and they get kind of degrading and such. And eventually he talks this woman who seems to have a good life into doing an interview, and then her husband, who's been cheating on her, watches it. And just look at the nature, the difference between the images of the husband watching and the videotaped image. The videotaped image already looks a bit like a horror film. It looks a bit like a found footage film 10 years before the found footage genre would become really important with the Blair Witch Project. Let's give this a watch.
Tell me your name.
Anne Bishop Mulaney.
So what do you want to talk about?
What do you usually talk about?
Sex.
Okay, let's talk about sex.
Do you have sex?
Not very often, no.
When you do, who usually initiates it?
He does.
Is the sex satisfying?
I don't know. I don't know what you mean.
So, interestingly enough, Sex, Lies, and Videotape is often considered to be one of the very first independent films. And independent films would essentially be the lifeblood for interesting filmmaking throughout the 1990s. But then again, so is Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer. David Cronenberg was always doing his own thing, so he's not really part of that independent movement. But eventually it produced such people as the Coen brothers, Quentin Tarantino, and more. So, but that's all the 1990s, and we'll eventually get to discussing it. So what's happening is we're seeing things leading us into the 1990s. Sonic Youth and that noise, independent movies. And of course, the comic books would eventually create the world we're in today with Marvel universe movies and all of that stuff. Another weird thing that was happening in that time was anime from Japan. Now, there was like the Transformers on television, and they had translated it for children so you could watch these things. But actually, in the 1980s, there was very little of this stuff. People tend to say, like, yeah, I got into anime back in the 1980s. No, you didn't. There's this article where this guy talks about what it was like to be an anime fan in the 1980s. You were totally underground. He said, these days, there might be 100 people who want to sign up for a ticket for some event for something. And he says, like back then, 100 people was the entirety of the anime world, the subculture in New York City in the 1980s. And I can testify this guy is absolutely right. Very few people. I used to work at Forbidden Planet in, say, 1986 and 1987. And we would get these Japanese comics, all in Japanese, that had images. We would get maybe, 40, 50 every month or two. And we had trouble selling them out. But what we didn't have trouble selling out was all the toys that were based on these things that were coming into the country. And the little robots. We had a whole toy section downstairs. But basically, that and manga. Manga is the Japanese comic books. These were things that, the book manga, you can see the cover here. This is the version I bought back then. And I used to go to this Japanese store, Kinokuniya, to buy, and this was like part of the ritual of anyone who was into this stuff then, to buy these comics from Japan. None of them were translated. You didn't start getting translations of these things until the tail end of the 80s, and then the beginning of the 90s. I think the Akira books came out and started getting more and more of them in the 90s. And it's the 90s that's really the anime culture. If you listen to anyone talk about, I grew up watching anime, find out when they were a kid. I guarantee you it was the 1990s more than the 1980s, except for Transformers, and maybe there was one other thing. The anime books, the manga books, and when I say anime books, they would actually put color reproductions of an entire movie into a little, 5-inch by 6-inch book or so. But I used to get these, I've since weeded out my collection, but I still have, about 20, 30 of these from that period that I really liked. But it was underground. But what was interesting to me was the sense of artwork. You know, people like Miyazaki were doing their early works in the 1980s. I really like this one. We're looking right now at something called Vampire Hunter D. Now, look at this imagery. And what I want you to notice is how unlike American comics and American cartoons this is. No muscular people. In fact, the main character, who's dressed a bit like a kind of a Puritan, is dressed as this elongated figure. And then you have these naked female figures, which you would never see in American cartoons, except, again, the heavy metal cartoons. But, anything coming, there was a Fritz the Cat animated feature, and then the heavy metal movie. But by and large, anything that looked with characters like this would be considered a Disney movie. And you would never, and to this day, you would never see a naked female body in a Disney cartoon. One of my favorites was called Angel and the Egg. And we're just going to watch a moment of that. And notice how unlike American films. Now, this is not your, transforming robots, Dragon Ball Z, action adventure anime. This is art. And it's very interesting art. And again, this was all underground. Eventually, anime and Japanese things would come overground. But let's watch Angel and the Egg a little bit right now. And finally, so far below the surface as to be almost invisible, and yet to me, perhaps the most important aspect of underground in the 80s, were the strange puppet films coming out of the Czech Republic and those influenced by Eastern Europe, the brothers Quays. We're going to watch a little bit of Jan Švankmajer's Alice. This is from the late 80s. And this is his Alice in Wonderland. And this is the Mad Hatter's Tea Party scene. You think you know it, but you don't. Švankmajer is a surrealist. And I more than once I've heard people who back in Alaska, some genius had given a copy, probably watched it and said, "Oh my God, what are we going to do with this?" Taken a copy down to the library for their DVD collection. And more than once I'd heard someone say, "Yeah, we rented that to watch with our children." And it was so weird. Well, yes, it is. Easily the strangest version of Alice in Wonderland that I've ever heard of. But here's the fascinating things. Often the parents would be like scratching their heads, and the kids would love it, because kids actually do like stuff like this. Let's watch a little bit of Švankmajer's Alice.
Why is a raven like a writing desk? Said the Mad Hatter.
And related to, but not necessarily so influenced by, Jan Švankmajer is the brothers Quay. They live in London and have lived there for many years, but they're actually from the Philadelphia area in Pennsylvania. And they went there, and they actually were very inspired by Polish animation. And they also went to puppet theaters like the Tone Marionette Theater in Brussels, places I know very well now. Because of them, I, in a sense, made pilgrimages to see certain things that they talked about. And but this is from a Polish book by Bruno Schulz, a strange Polish writer from the mid-20th century. And it's called Street of Crocodiles. And we're just going to watch a little bit of the early part of the movie. It's about 25 minutes long. Well worth seeing. But again, you'd have to like what you're about to see to watch it. This is not going to be easy watching by any means. It's going to make Jan Švankmajer's Alice look like a walk in the park. But check this out. And notice the feeling of decay. And this feeling of decay shows up in Švankmajer quite often too. The feeling of European decay. But I think, as we saw, there's a sense of decay in the American Gothic material of Tom Waits and Nick Cave. There's a sense of decay of the end of a society in so much of what we're hearing. The goth stuff. Not to be confused with American Gothic. American Gothic is a very different thing than goth music. Goth has always got this European angle. European darkness, castles, vampires and stuff. Whereas American Gothic is about the decay of America, the insanity of America, the end of American culture. It is the opposite of the American normal sense of, it's the flip side of the normal sense of optimism that Americans have. But you can feel that sense of decay in the Quay brothers film as well. Watch a little bit of Street of Crocodiles with me. So, that's the end of part one of our How We Got Here movie edition remix, and this is not supposed to be a history of movies even during this period. This is supposed to be about the relationship of film and visual material to the lives we now live and how these things impacted us in our lives today. Next time, in part 2, we come to the late 90s and we discuss the changes there that happened to create a more commercial and fantasy-oriented epoch in the late 90s, early aughts of the 21st century. So, come back again. This is Vern in Georgia saying Droabit, which in Georgian means temporarily. We will meet again.
When I go, I want you to give me 5 minutes. I told you boys I'm no escape artist. For the first time, I like the odds.
At the round earth's imagined corners, blow your trumpets, angels, and arise, arise from death, you numberless infinities of souls.
We happy? Vincent! We happy?
Yeah, we happy.
You came to me just yesterday. You said that you were gone away. You found another to take my place. Now what's this rolling down my face?